see everyone. Welcome. My name is Louise. I'm the Division Chair of STR, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Impact and Relevance session. This year at STR, we've run several events under the theme of Impact and Relevance, and this is actually the last in the series. Today, we're going to discuss how to collect data for impact, and I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting conversation. I look forward to it. Thank you very much to all of you for being here, and to Florence and Honore for co-organizing and hosting this session. If you are interested in this topic, then please also join us in Chicago for the STR plenary, where we are also going to address impact and relevance with strategic management research. I'm going to hand over to Florence now to introduce today's sessions and our speakers.
Okay, thank you, Louise. Thank you for helping me and the other officers throughout the year in organizing those events. So this event, as you said, is the last one. But when we think a little bit of the research process, it could have been the first one. So I hope it motivates everybody to start great research project over the summer. So I think in strategy, we often work with secondary data. Then we can be a little bit more limited in the mechanisms we can identify, and then the implications we might deduct from our work. So today we're going to switch to collecting and generating our own data. So basically, what can we do to collect high quality primary data that will help us have impact on the research world, but also on the real world. So we assemble a panel of experts who are going to talk about different methods. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists in the order in which they're going to intervene. They each have 8 minutes. And then at the end, we'll have plenty of time for group discussion and Q&As. Okay, so our panelists. So we have Elena Novelli from City University of London, Tim Hart from University of North Carolina-Chapell Hill, Margarethe Wieserma from University of California-Irvine, Michael Leiblein from Ohio State University, and Henry Sauermann from ESMT Berlin. So with all that, let's start with Elena. I'm going to stop sharing. And then Elena, I believe you can share your slides.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So I suppose you can see my slides now, so let me know otherwise. So hello, everyone. And first of all, thank you, Florence and Louise, for organizing this event, which is on a quite important topic in my view. So today, Florence and Louise have given me the task to talk about how to generate impactful data by talking about my experience, in particular with field experiments. So I think this is a quite interesting case, because in the case of field experiment, you can actually make impact while generating data. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And in order to talk about this topic, I'm going to give you the example of one specific field experiment I've run, so that we can talk about the opportunities and challenges associated with this methodology with some more context in mind. So the specific example I have for you today is the case of the UK government. So in 2018, the Department of Business and Trade faced a conundrum. The conundrum was that about 96% of all business in the UK have less than 10 employees, but these companies only account for 22% of turnover and 33% of employment. So essentially, DBT was essentially facing a question. So can we do something for these firms by essentially teaching them to improve their performance by making their decision-making more systematic? So they set up a call for a grant program that essentially had the idea to, on the one hand, deliver support for these companies, but at the same time also be able to measure the impact created. So that's the grant that I have received, and based on which, together with colleagues at other institutions, I have organized a field experiment. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of the structure so that you have in mind, especially those of you who might not be familiar already with what a field experiment might entail, how it looks like. you can have an idea of the structure. So essentially what we did was, first of all, to recruit participants and conduct baseline interviews with participants. So the idea here was to embed the field experiment and the intervention in the context of a fully fledged business support program, because this was the goal of the entire scheme. After this, what we did was to randomly allocate these companies into treatment and control groups. And then what we did, we delivered an intervention that lasted for 3 months, that was followed by 7 months of general support. So what did we do for this company? So both groups were essentially taking part in a fully fledged business support program. In particular, the control group had access, was exposed to strategy frameworks and templates, like, for example, the business model canvas or the balance scorecard, as well as evidence gathering techniques, like, for example, A/B testing and service qualitative interviews. We did exactly the same thing for the treatment group. However, we essentially taught them to use the same tools and techniques that we taught to the control group, but we taught them to use with what we call the scientific approach to decision making. So essentially, when we were explaining to them about the strategy frameworks and template, we were encouraging them to use them to develop a theory of the problem faced and logical hypothesis. And then when we were exposing them to evidence gathering techniques, we were essentially encouraging them to use those techniques to test the theories and the hypotheses developed previously. And then what we did, we monitored and collected data about these firms on their key choices and performance for about 10 months. Now, what did I learn through this program in terms of what are the opportunities and challenges of randomized controlled trials? So first of all, in terms of opportunities, obviously, methodologically, a field experiment is like the gold standard to obtain robust evidence on causal relationships. So obviously, this is one of the strengths of this type of approach. Second, what was really great about this opportunity was that it gave me the opportunity to really get access to very deep and broad insights that were later helpful in terms to understand what were the mechanisms underlying the effect that we observed, but also in terms of giving us insights regarding what other research questions would be really interesting to study in the future, and so to advance the research agenda in this area. Third, I think what's really important to consider in the context of field experiment is that they really constitute an opportunity to make a real impact on the user community and to influence our policy. So, for example, in the context of this field experiment I've just mentioned, I had the chance to later discuss with the Department of Business and Trade the results of my research, and also to talk about this with other governmental agencies. So I think this is something that is pretty unique of this type of data collection process. But what are the challenges that we face? And I want to also mention some potential solutions for those of you who are interested in exploring this possibility of collecting data. So first of all, they are logistical. So for example, in the context of the program that we ran, we had to hire an entire team of researchers. We had to recruit them, we had to monitor them, we had to find ways to coordinate. At some point, for example, I was coordinating a team of 50. So obviously, this requires some thinking into it. At the same time, participants are effectively signing up to a business support program. So they expect customer care, for example. They expect someone to answer their emails. They expect to be informed about everything that happens. They expect to find value for their time. So obviously, the way in which this can be done is by essentially mapping all the steps of the participants and research team journey. And it's very important to design robust organizational process that really go to the very minimal details. The second challenge can be the funding. Field experiments can be expensive. So there are multiple ways to approach this issue. On the one hand, like in the case of the field experiment I've just mentioned, you can apply to a research grant. Now, obviously, this might be easier if your institution is one that supports the application for research grant. In fact, one that values those positively in the perspective of promotion. Alternatively, you can partner with colleagues with grant experience. And then the question becomes, what can you bring to the partnership? So for example, if you have great organizational skills, there is definitely a partnership opportunity awaiting for you. The third alternative is that of thinking whether you can partner with companies or with accelerators. Now, obviously, if the field experiment is embedded in the context of an organization that exists, in the context of metrics that are anyway collected, the cost can be substantially lower. But then the key question here is to think about whether you can find a research question that advances research, but it is also relevant for that organization so that incentives are aligned. And finally, what I want to mention is that clearly a data collection process that involves making impact is a great responsibility. So an important question to think about very, very carefully is, are you really delivering value to these participants? And also, are you really delivering value to both experimental groups? Now, obviously, in order to run a field experiment, you will have to go through the institutional review board at your institution. But I think it's very important to really think carefully about this question for the responsibility it entails. And so try to design a process that allows for plenty of feedbacks in the design phase from colleagues and also from other stakeholders. So I'll pause here and look forward to hear if there are any questions. What I just want to say is that in case you're interested in the results of this field experiment, this is forthcoming on SMJ, and I would be happy to share the results with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elena. And now we're going to switch to Tim. And as Louise wrote in the chat, don't hesitate to type your questions.
All right. Sorry, I just need to move this Zoom bar. I'm Tim Ott from UNC. I want to thank our organizers for putting this together and for including me. I've been tasked by Florence with talking about the impact from interviews. And so a little bit about me first. My research is really at the intersection of strategy formation processes in entrepreneurial settings and the micro foundations of entrepreneurial learning. My published research anyway. I've also got some other working papers that fall into this space. And you can probably tell this by looking at these titles, but everything is a process here that I'm interested in. So I'm a qualitative researcher for that reason. And importantly for today, that means that interviews are not my only source of data, but they are a major source of data for me. When Florence contacted me about today, I was like, well, thank you, but really? I don't know that I've had that much impact yet in the field or in business more broadly. When we think about impact in the field, we can certainly think about citations, but I think at this point, most of us think about something other than citations and making an academic impact when we think about that word. And I don't know that I've been impactful yet, but I'm trying to be more so. So I wanted to touch on what I think I've learned about being more impactful with my research, especially with using interviews in order to gather data. The first thing I'll say is that all of the general advice for interview techniques apply, right? You're going to sample theoretically, you're going to standardize questions with interview guides, you're going to engage in courtroom questioning so you're not leading your informants, event tracking, multiple waves of interviews, multiple informants in order to triangulate what you're hearing. But I also think that there are some things that might be different from the way I originally approached doing qualitative work through interviews. I think you should ask different research questions to have more impact. You should study different populations, and you need to be able to build empathy with objectivity. I'll talk about each one of those things quickly. Asking different research questions probably is not just for interviews. I think we can all think about this through a variety of research techniques. But you start by, rather than coming up with research questions by finding something that hasn't been done before, some phenomenon that's intriguing but not fully explained by literature, also ask, do other people care, and who cares? If you talk to business executives or your MBA students, do they care? Do policymakers or community members care? With how ventures craft strategy, my dissertation topic, I can get MBAs interested in that topic, but it's harder to get my family members or other community members interested in that. More recently, I've been looking at more grand challenge type questions that are still aligned with my interests. So things like, how do entrepreneurs in the carbon removal industry leverage public and private partnerships to build their firms and the industry as a whole? And does prison entrepreneurship training work? And if so, why? Still process questions, still things I'm interested in, but much more something that other people will care a lot more about. Another way to think about this is, if I answer these questions, will it translate directly into something that I can teach or implement? And this is where I've liked the way Todd Zenger, Teppo Fellin, and Elena, who was just talking about her paper in this space, have been thinking about strategy as the theory-based view. This is definitely something that the goal of that project is to be able to teach entrepreneurs in a different way, so it's something you can implement very well. And interviews as a methodology are particularly good for questions that translate to teaching like this, because they're often process questions, and processes can be taught. So second, when you're thinking about who to interview, you can think about interviewing different populations. But doing this is actually harder than interviewing a lot of the venture-backed founders that I interviewed for my dissertation. When I think about talking to venture-backed founders, I actually think it's pretty easy. Yes, you need to get in contact with these people, but these founders very often love to talk about what they're doing and love to talk in general. So once you get in contact with them, it's actually pretty easy to interview them. But we should be talking to a much wider range of entrepreneurs, I think. And part of the problem is, how do you define what this other category is? Because when you're doing theoretical sampling for this type of work, you need very clear bounds on who your sample is. Is it the idea stage, or pre-funding, or lifestyle, or developing economies? And how do you define all those things? So there are lots of different ways we could define this sample other than high growth, venture-backed firms, but those are typically harder to define, and then finding those people can be harder. So I had a project I was working on where I was looking for pre-seed stage entrepreneurs, but those who were still looking to grow, and that's just it's a sample that's hard to find and hard to make contact with. It's also harder to study these different populations because some of the populations that might be most impactful to interview are harder to gain access to. We went through this with the paper I was just talking about, studying the efficacy of the prison entrepreneurship training program in Texas. We wanted to interview people to understand why the training program had been successful, but that means you need to track these people down. Ideally, you would want to also talk to people who recidivated and went back to prison, as well as those that didn't. But if they're currently in prison, they're then a protected population for IRB. They're also much harder to get in touch with. You can't just schedule a Zoom call whenever you want. So these populations that we want to study are going to be more difficult to study. And then lastly, when you're actually doing the interviews, I think you have an added challenge here as well. Rapport with your subjects in interviews is always something that's really important, because you want them talking. You don't want to be the one talking the entire time. If they're not being forthcoming, then the interview is like pulling teeth. But when you're trying to ask more impactful research questions, a lot of times the subjects that you're talking about and that you're asking about can be more delicate. And I think you need to go further than just being friendly, than building this rapport. You need real empathy for the subjects in order to get the best data. You end up a lot of times covering very sensitive topics. So the PEP project I was talking about, the subjects end up discussing crimes, abuse, racism, etc. So in talking about these sensitive topics, you also end up with more of a divide between you as the interviewer and the informant a lot of times, which can become harder to bridge. And then lastly here, with these more delicate subjects, there's more of a possibility of causing real harm. So unlike Elena, where you want to actually have impact, here, when you're interviewing people, you really don't want to have impact, both because you don't want to influence the research, but also because having impact can be a bad thing. So when I'm talking to former prisoners, reliving abuse or drug addiction can cause mental strain for people, more than recounting how they raised their last venture capital fund, which was some of my other founders. This means you really do need to develop some empathy for people. But the problem with developing real empathy for your informants is that it becomes more difficult then to remain objective as well. If you really feel for your informants, if you start rooting for them, then you may not actually ask the needed questions, or you may infer things that aren't even there. So you need more empathy, but you also need to maintain objectivity, which is a lot harder. Thank you. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, so next speaker is Margarethe.
Hi, and thank you, Florence and Louisa, for including me in this panel, which is, I find, I'm already learning things I didn't know because I don't do experiments. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how to think about generating impactful research, and then also how data collection falls into that. I'm a researcher that's probably best known for my empirical work, a lot of it in SMJ. And so many people think of me as utilizing secondary source data to generate hypotheses and testing and so forth. However, all of my research has been very, very much phenomena driven. And I think in that respect, I probably stand out from a lot of other scholars who are much more theory driven. And despite whether you're a theory-driven scholar or a phenomena-driven scholar like myself, I think it's important to fully understand what it is you're going to study. And I find that theory-driven scholars sometimes don't spend the time ahead of driving their hypotheses to actually explore what it is that they're going to investigate. I run into doctoral students who've never encountered and never talked to managers, and then they're trying to explain something, and they really have no idea what what the phenomena is or what the context of the phenomena is. So being a phenomena-driven scholar, my research questions come from what I would consider the issues that happen in practice. Starting with my dissertation in the 1980s, when there was a lot of upheaval in corporate America in terms of portfolio compositions, a lot of divesting, a lot of restructuring that was going on, and that was the focus of my DV was strategic change. So it was very corporate strategy driven. Though I used a lot of secondary data to explore that, looking at top manager characteristics, it wasn't like I came in there with the theory of upper echelons driving my hypotheses. I was very strongly trained in economics. And so I had all these economic characteristics at the industry level as well as at the firm level that would explain my DV, meaning strategic change. And instead, what I found from looking at the data, because back then you couldn't necessarily just grab what you wanted from words or whatever, you actually had to go to the microfiche reader and look at the raw data by firm, is I've discovered that there was a lot of executive successions going on at the same time all this strategic change was going on. And so it kind of allowed me to sort of rethink the issue, which is maybe it's not the economics that's driving the change, but maybe it's actually managers that are driving the change and the change in the managers that are at the head of the firm. And that led me to my dissertation paper, which is my most cited papers, I don't know, 4,800 sites or whatever, on strategic change being driven by managers. But the reason I relay this story is that I would have never encountered this if I hadn't spent a bit of more time examining what was going on at the phenomenal level. So this is what I urge all scholars to do, is before you start digging into the analysis of your data, and before you even collect your data, maybe spend a bit more time qualitatively in exploring the nature of the relationships you're trying to investigate. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter whether you're theory-driven or not, reading about the subject more broadly, like reading about it in the Financial Times, or typically, since I'm very much in the governance area, I'll read what's going on in the law and the finance journals about a particular issue, because you're going to learn a lot from what the scholars outside your discipline have looked at, especially finance, because finance does a lot of empirical investigations and they find a lot of relationships, but there's not a lot of theory in those relationships. So you gain a lot of insights from just looking at what others are doing in other disciplines. And like I said, also talking to managers and also finding out what's going on, a more broad-based phenomena. So the FT, the Financial Times, is a really key source for me when it comes to things at the board level or things on sustainability, which I'm currently interested in, or hedge fund activism, which I have several papers on, because you want to know what is going on. Who's the next firm that's being attacked by Elliott or whatever, so that you can understand what's going on with the phenomena itself. And then the second stage of that, you know, because that's like a sort of a broad-based search that you can do, is to really get to know what's going on, is to actually talk to individuals in organizations about the topic. And so even if you end up doing an empirically driven study, I think there's a lot of insights that can be gained by actually interviewing a few managers or a few board members about what it is that you're researching. So my hedge fund activist papers are all empirical studies, but I've interviewed over a dozen activist investors. I've interviewed board directors who've sat on boards that have had an attack by activists, and I've interviewed CEOs that have been targeted by activists. And I have never written a paper about my qualitative investigation, but those qualitative insights led me to understand what is going on, because it's a black box. You know, you can't really understand what's going on in the boardroom because it's pretty much a black box. You don't really know how executives are dealing with investors, because that's another black box. So you need to understand the phenomena a bit deeper. And the only way to really get there is to actually talk to some of the people involved in this. And it's incredible how much insight you can gain. You know, with respect to the hedge fund activism, I learned a lot more than even the FT journalists did on what was going on. The directors that were appointed, for example, you know, activists would appoint directors on companies' boards, were being paid by the activists, and they were being paid handsomely. They're called golden handcuffs. No one even talked about this, okay? I mean, when I brought it up, they go, what? I go, there's a thing called golden handcuffs, that, you know, the directors are not just getting their board pay, but they're actually being compensated by the activists if they can get the stock price to go up during their tenure as a board member. And that payment by the activists is multiple times what their director salary will be. So it's like, now you understand why somebody would want to be an activist director, because normally being an activist director would be being blackballed. You wouldn't be asked to be on another board because you're considered one of the bad guys. Well, now you know, you can serve on one board and make more money than somebody serving on 10 boards. So it was kind of an interesting insight that you would never have gained, you know, not talking to individuals that sat on boards. But Tim did a great job of talking about, you know, doing research and talking to people in qualitative research. But I just want to sort of expand this by saying that you don't need to do a qualitative research design to do qualitative research. There's a lot to be gained by talking to managers that can provide insights that you can then explore empirically. And if you don't talk to managers, you're probably, you know, either very theory-driven or you're building off of prior work, and that has a more narrow lens. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be all that impactful as a result, because you're missing a lot of the picture when you're kind of doing something based on the past or based on a theory that was driven 30 or 40 years ago. So let me just give one last example. A lot of the literature in governance is based on governance characteristics that no longer exist. And it's a complete departure from reality. You know, I keep seeing as a reviewer, papers that are written about board independence. Well, board independence isn't an issue in the last 10 years. Ever since Sarbanes-Oxley passed, boards have to be predominantly independent directors. So people who keep bringing this up, this is not an issue that is of interest anymore. This is way gone. You know, the SEC took care of this. The Sarbanes-Oxley took care of this. So you have these issues that no longer are issues, but if you look at the literature, you think that this is still an issue. It is not an issue. And similarly, other things, even theories, are theories of Gender stereotypes, for example, which Louise and I, in our paper on board gender diversity, we could not find solid evidence for the existence of gender stereotypes at the board level. And you ask yourself the question, like, here are this strong development of theories about stereotypes and biases that exist based on gender. Well, you look at these studies that form the basis of these stereotypes, and they were all done with students or young people. And it's like, well, maybe the theory doesn't really apply at the executive level. And that's one of the things we kind of gained an insight from, is that sometimes our theories that were developed within a specific context, usually experimental context, aren't necessarily going to fit a setting that's quite different. So there's a lot to be gained by talking to managers and talking to board directors. And Tim did a good job about how getting access and the challenges of getting access. And you might ask the question, well, is it going to be really difficult to get access to executives and directors? Yes, they're not the easiest people to reach. They're not typically your students. You can't usually build off of that. But, you know, most universities have some type of board which is at an C-level suite, and you can gain access to those individuals usually. And then it's fairly easy to utilize the connections that you make through interviewing them to connect to others. And then I've also used connections from my co-authors or connections from students who have introduced me to CEOs or board directors. And so you have an opportunity to connect that way. And I think, as Tim correctly pointed out, most of these people are more than willing to talk to you. It's just getting on their calendar that becomes the challenge. But once you get a contact and they trust what you're doing, they're more than willing to talk to you. That's not the barrier. The barrier is sometimes getting the connection. So I'll just end there by just encouraging all of you, even despite the kind of research that you do, before you start doing too much of it, spend a few days really trying to understand what it is that you're trying to study by talking to real people. Okay. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's really, really important. So then maybe go to the next step. If we want to ask questions to many people at the same time, we'll get into Michael's then talk with the survey.
Okay, thank you. I hope everybody can hear me and see me. Thank you, Florence and Louise, for organizing this event. And I've already, I'll share Margarethe's point of, I've learned quite a bit. I was unsure how this was all going to come together. I'll say at the outset, my points might be a little bit different from the others. The research, the academic research I've done, you know, I've worked with an NSF grant on a large data set, completed some modeling work, but I think that work I think is better testing causal arguments carefully. But what I think my role is today is to talk about some primary data I've collected over the last couple of years that's trying to get at some of the distinctive contributions of strategic management research. And this started, honestly, and it might be useful to point out, it started with a National Center for the Middle Market grant, which was run by this guy, Tom Stewart. Tom used to be the editor of HBR. And so it's a very practical and, to use Louise's word, relevant sort of initiative. At the same time, I was thinking, you know, more deeply about what's truly distinctive about strategic management and how are strategy problems different from maybe other types of problems where it might be simpler to get or test causal identification. So what I've tried to do is sort of test some of my fears about what is going on in the field. And I think that's what led Florence and Louise to maybe ask me to join this group. So what I will talk about pretty briefly is a few surveys, some with they're all non-scientific convenience samples. Some are with the Strategic Management Review, and when we launched, what we were talking about, maybe the more interesting things for the scholars on the call is some work we've done more recently with Boston Consulting Group and the Henderson Institute We had an event in New York last summer, and we're going to have another event early this fall, where we're trying to identify what are relevant problems to CEOs and senior consultants, and then how we might merge that, or how we might think of a Euler-like diagram of strategy research and practical interest. So let me move on. Again, my motivation is there's this growing divide, or sense that there's a growing divide between strategy research, teaching, and practice. This is a belief of mine that we've, as a field, have lost maybe some consensus on our purpose. There's some fragmentation. You might think of the paper by Tammy Madsen, Rob Grant, and Rudy Durand, maybe my work with Jeff Ryer, Saikat Chattery, and Todd Zenger. But I wanted to test that. The second belief is that we've, as a field, have historically contributed above and beyond IO, OB operations by building this sort of these interdisciplinary perspectives around these classic challenges of resource allocation, the scope of the firm, corporate governance, the pursuit of competitive advantage, et cetera. So I've been trying to test that and how that might be changing in a world that is undergoing much change itself. So my approach, if you will, has been to ask these convenience surveys. So the first was on primary topical areas. So I'll just briefly show you some data in a second, where this is Jeff and I looked at the SMS, IGs, the AOM, identified SMS interest groups, AOM topical tracks, identified 5 questions for each of those topical areas, and then generated a convenience sample of senior academics and senior executives. So these are folks that are on our main editorial boards and folks, CEO suite, C-suite folks identified through our contacts as well as BCG contacts, et cetera. And the idea was to compare how these folks addressed or thought about the satisfaction and importance of several of the questions that we as academics were saying were central to each of these topical areas. So, I'll just flash this slide for a second, right? So this is for the competitive strategy area of SMS, right? These are things we saw on, questions we would see that are central to that area as identified by prior IG leaders, identified on the website a couple of years ago, et cetera. And we just ask people, tell us how important are these questions and how satisfied are you with the responses? So, the first thing, I'll also flash this slide. There's pretty broad agreement across both groups, okay? Just at a high level, the image on the left is reporting perceptions of the importance of 5 research questions across each of these topical areas. For academics and practitioners, the academics are in red, the practitioners are in blue. You see this strong association. The image on the right is talking about the satisfaction with current answers, okay? But there's also some interesting differences, and that's what maybe I'll focus a little bit on today. This image is in the innovation literature, and in particular Tony Olwick's jobs to be done approach. He's got this way of plotting satisfaction and importance, and we're borrowing that. So I've plotted the average responses to those 55 questions for academics in red and practitioners in blue, and then applied that sort of over-serving concept, appropriately serving concept, and under-serving concept. So I'm trying to get at, are there ideas here where practitioners are saying, there's important work that you academics haven't given us good answers on. And so, if I move forward, just one and flash this, focus on the underserved areas. To me, it seems, first of all, if you look in that green area, that's largely blue. So the practitioner, we're very proud as academics that we've appropriately addressed many important questions in strategy that are maybe ignored by some of the functional areas in the college. The practitioners are less impressed. They think we've addressed important problems, but maybe less satisfied with our solutions. So our responses from this, again, non-scientific convenience sample, but this is 140 or so folks. that we've underserved, interest definitions and measures of competitive advantage, how we link resources and supporting competitive advantage, the role of dynamic adaptation of resources, the role of corporate organization, corporate strategy, or corporate governance and corporate strategy. We can debate whether this is lost in translation or research problems, but I think it's a call to reassess some of the fundamental questions that I think generated a lot of the interest in something called strategic management in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. I'll go through, admittedly, that slide and a lot of that work was backward looking, right? We identified classic questions that were identified by the IGs, and we're just testing this hypothesis about fragmentation in the field and dissatisfaction. But we've also been forward looking. So we had some open-ended questions. This was this event in New York City last year. And we were like, what topics do you believe are critical for the field to address in the next decade? And these are sort of open-ended questions with, typically 3, 4, well, in the room I'm thinking of last year, we had 3, 4 CEOs, maybe half a dozen chief strategy officers, dozen senior consultants, and a handful of academics. And so this is, I'll just, flash this. What we get are, here are some of the issues on the minds of that group. And we're testing this with broader, again, convenience samples, but broader numbers of individuals. And so, these are what Martin Reeves likes to call untamed issues. So BCG's interest is identifying questions and bringing together some historical clients to see if we can identify, he can identify new work. But if I just drill down just one little bit on these, let's say if I think about the changing time horizons problem, there's a lot of interest in how the changing time scales that are in terms of asset investment and return are affecting managerial decisions. If I think about uncertainty at the Utah Summit, I'll be talking a lot about, and several people will be talking about, what do we mean by uncertainty? And I've recently uncovered 20 or so words that we use to describe basically the same phenomenon in our theory. But when we start thinking about each of these concepts of uncertainty, what are the ramifications of them? And in particular, if we think about all the volatility that's going on, do we need to think about the BCG book? The group is talking about, what are the ramifications of managing in this context of constant tension, constant volatility? So in the interest of sticking with my timeline or close to it, I hope I'm close to it. Let me close with these 3 final points. There is I think a real challenge of domain drift in our field. We're losing sight of what's classically strategy. And, I've a ton of survey work I've given you a hint at, that suggests many in our field, in particular, many of the senior folks in our field are well aware of this challenge. Even simple non-scientific surveys, snowballed lists of academics and practitioners are highlighting this disconnect. I think there's evidence, at least to the extent you'll accept my survey data, that senior managers are pretty hungry for traditional strategy work. And then there are some ways of using open-ended questions to think about how the changes, the fairly drastic changes in our environment, are requiring us to adapt old theory to address some of these classic problems. So I hope that's helpful and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, let's switch to Henry, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Perfect. Well, thank you also from my side to the organizers for setting this up and for everybody to join from different places at different times of the day. So Michael kind of provided the perfect setup for me, which is surveys, but I think about it as a method for primary data collection rather than to learn about what we should study, both of which are obviously interesting. So I think surveys are interesting because they're very old methods, so to speak, but they may not be as salient in the general discussion and research as they used to be, but I want to make a case for them and show you a path of the future, so to speak, and that's something that I've just developed very recently, like in the last few hours. So just to kind of maybe give you 2 reasons for why I think surveys are still very helpful, even though we have now field experiments and we have large data sets and public data sets and so on. And the one main reason is we can observe constructs that we cannot otherwise observe, even with many of these cool methods that we have. So if you have access to all these amazing big data sets, including Scandinavians, there's always stuff that you don't see in there. And that includes particularly things that are just simply not codified. So not even just kept secret, but where nobody actually has codified them. So what could that be? Well, for example, psychological constructs such as motivations for starting new ventures, expectations of market developments, or why incumbents decided not to respond to emerging threats. These are things you will not see by just seeing observable kind of quantitative data. And I think particularly the last one is interesting. Very often we can see stuff that happens, but not stuff that didn't happen. But surveys can actually help us understand things that didn't happen. For example, why an incumbent looked at new technology and decided not to act, or an entrepreneur, or a potential entrepreneur saw an opportunity, but decided not to take it. So one general reason, I think, observing constructs that are difficult to observe in codified and publicly available data. Second reason is getting at mechanisms. So I think many of these big data methods that you have nowadays are giving you correlations that are consistent with causation, but clearly not causal evidence. So then we have the field experiments as an alternative, and that is great. It's not as easy to do experiments in strategy as it is in, like, you know, psychology, for example. But the other problem with experiments is they tell you that X can cause Y, but if you want to understand why a Y happens, it doesn't mean that the X that you're studying is the one that's driving it in reality, right? So it just is a plausible mechanism possible, but it's not telling you that this was the mechanism. So surveys can help you because they can ask about why. You can literally ask the deciders, why did you decide something? Or you can ask about intermediate constructs, like these mediators that sit between the X and Y. Even they are not codified, but you can ask about them to see some of these intervening variables to get to more causal chains. Not perfect, but it's a complement to some of the other methods. So clearly surveys have a lot of challenges, but they can be solved because given that it's a pretty established method, there's also a lot of literature on how to do it and how to succeed. One question is finding out whom to ask. And so their one recommendation is to really think about who is actually making the decisions. It's not the firm, it's someone inside the firm. So figuring out who that is. Getting contact info is obviously tricky. And there's a lot of literature you can look at to develop surveys. There's a lot of best practices. And I think one personal experience is there's a temptation to ask too many questions because you're not limited. You can ask about all of these weird things that you think could be important. The risk is that you're asking a lot of questions in a shallow way, and in the end, you only need a few, but then you didn't have enough depth on the specific constructs you want. So it takes a lot of thinking beforehand and also pruning to not overload the survey with many different things, but really focus on what's important and then nail those questions so they convince the reviewers. And I recommend this kind of very, kind of popular book. Dillman is the guy who actually developed the surveys for the census. So essentially everything you need to know about the practice of surveys in terms of developing them is in that book. Now, one big challenge, especially in strategy, is getting people to respond. You probably get a lot of emails in your mailboxes asking you to fill in surveys, and you don't do it, just like me. So this is really tricky. One big recommendation is do a good survey, because once people click on it and they see the first page has typos in it or the questions don't make any sense, they will not continue. So good surveys is the best advice to do, also get response rates. Otherwise, think about the best context strategy. And we have a paper, it's now 10 years old, but I think still the conceptual framework and some of the empirical data are quite interesting to think about. How do you best time and think about how to reach out to respondents using online methods like emails, for example. So that's what I planned to have. And then I had one more idea, which is, nowadays everything has to be about AI. And I think there is a completely new way of thinking about surveys in the age of AI. And I'll give you two examples. So one is, whereas it used to be a lot of work to get feedback on surveys from trial, from colleagues, from potential respondents, you can now do it through AI. And what I did is I took that survey. We did a big survey 10 years ago following PhDs, more than 10,000 PhDs in the US over their career life cycle. And I uploaded that PDF as it is with just 50 pages with all the formatting that was in there. And I asked ChatGPT, give me ways to improve the survey. And within the first click, it essentially tells me how I should rephrase certain kind of questions. Should I combine certain kind of questions? That I have to be consistent in how I use Likert scales, that I may have to split certain questions to make them more easily answerable and so on. So this is a perfect use for AI, I think, and I would encourage you to do it. Now comes the scary part. I also asked ChatGPT, here's my survey instrument. I want to test it with you. Please pretend to be a pool of biology PhD students at top-tier US institutions. Now create 100 responses to all the questions and save them in a CSV file. Do not create them randomly, but try to generate responses I could expect to receive from a sample of real PhD students, including correlations between variables and so on. Please generate the responses as numerical values, as opposed, to verbal responses. And it's very happy to do so. It says to generate realistic survey responses from a pool of biology PhD students. I will take into account the general trends and experiences typical of such students. I'll use these patterns to create correlated and meaningful responses. And it shows me how it's doing. So it's running this big new code, running it all within like a minute. And it says your responses have been generated and saved. You can download the file from the following link. Does it work? Yes, it does. It gives me a big spreadsheet with all these survey responses exactly in the way that I would want to see them in terms of the distributions and so on and so forth. And then I ask it, okay, so what's the correlation between the number of peer-reviewed articles and the perceived progress in the program? So this is PhD students, right? And it's very smart. It says, I can compute it for you. It is minus 0.08. So there's no relationship. I'm saying, well, wouldn't you expect a positive relationship in reality? And ChatGPT is smart. It says, yes, in reality, we would indeed expect a positive relationship between the number of peer-reviewed articles, because publishing is generally seen as a sign of productivity and success, which would likely enhance the students' perception of their progress. So ChatGPT actually has the right theory, right? It just didn't put it in the data. So then I asked it, well, how could we make the data more realistic? And it gave me the answers. Well, we should first, I should check the distribution of the program. Probably there should be more students in the earlier stages than in the later stages, which it hadn't done in the first place. Perceived progress distribution, probably we should have more progress in later years than earlier years. And the correlation between publications and progress, probably we should adjust the data to make sure that real students who publish more frequently get higher progress. I said, okay, well, do make the data more realistic. And that's a result, exactly as you would think about it, as the internet would believe it, which is the relationship between perceived progress and number of publications is positive, and that also varies by stage of the program if you dig in the data. So this sounds like a fun little exercise that we shouldn't take too seriously, but we should actually take it seriously because there are discussions now about using silicon samples for surveys because they have two big advantages. One is it's cheaper and faster. I did this essentially in the hour before this talk today. And the other big fundamental advantage could be that we are avoiding these non-response biases and lack of representativeness that we get with traditional surveys, where the busy people are the ones who are not responding, right? So you get certain systematic biases, which you may not have to get if you ask ChatGPT to represent the universe of, for example, PhD students in biology. Of course, there are many problems, such as biases in the training data. For example, there's some research that the internet is overpopulated by extroverts. So you have many more posts and entries on web pages of people who are extroverts than introverts. Probably you're going to find more information about successful firms than failed firms. So the data are not representative on the internet. The data may also have baked in wrong assumptions about human behavior. So if everybody on Twitter expresses certain biases, the internet believes, and therefore ChatGPT will believe that this is what relationships look like, and that will be reflected in the made-up data. And the results may be too dependent on prompt engineering. And as I showed you, it really depends on how much I push ChatGPT to give me certain kinds of relationships, and then it can do it. But I did not make this up. This is actually really a discussion that's going on right now. I just saw a few weeks ago this paper in PNAS, which is like one of these science journals, discussing whether and how generative AI can improve social sciences. And the use of silicon samples for surveys was one of the main discussion points there. Again, huge advantages and possible cost efficiencies, not bothering people and so on, but also obviously many of the big problems that we have in AI discussions in general. So I encourage you to not just do it, but think about it. Think about the problems with existing surveys. Can you use AI for any of these things? Be very careful, obviously, with generating data, but this is a discussion that will happen, and I'm very curious to see what's going to happen in 2 or 3 years. And I could imagine that some of these applications will make it in journals and maybe should make it in journals if we are careful enough and are transparent about how data were generated. All right, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Henry. First, I want to give a few minutes to the panelists. Do you want to react to each other's presentations or have a comment? Or are you a bit worried by what Henry just showed us? To me, I mean, the main thing is we have to make sure that researchers are disclosing that they're using a silicon sample, because I think that's the part that's really worrying. But So other like comments, otherwise I can switch to the chat and go back to the questions.
So we hear if this panelists want to react a little bit to the others' inputs first, Florence.
Yes, so we have, I mean, feel free, like, so I see Michael, Henry, Margarethe, Tim, or Elena, if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to jump in.
Yes, I mean, in terms of reacting, first of all, I really enjoyed everyone's presentations. What I want to say is that what I find fascinating, and that really this panel, these presentations are really showing, is, you know, the way I see it is that our job is to understand more about the world, to, let's say, advance knowledge. And the way I see it is that all these types of approaches are really complementing each other, right? So each of them has advantages, also limitations. But what I think it's interesting is that in a way, each of these approaches can complement the limitations of the other. So I think this is very interesting, and also relates to what Margarethe was saying earlier, right? So even if you are doing secondary data, maybe you know, talking to your observation points can be a way to make a secondary data piece of research more important, more interesting, and more impactful.
So I just want to comment about Michael, because he kind of gave this broad overview of the field of strategy and how we've lost focus. And I know that's a big debate in the field, and it's also obviously going to drive research questions. So I think it's applicable to this session. I do agree with that we've lost focus, but not focus of the past, but lost focus of what's important for business is how I would describe it. I think we're somewhat a little bit too much of navel gazing, looking at what we've done in the past and focus on issues that in the field have been important issues in the past and perhaps are not important issues so much anymore. And I think part of that, I would call it myopic perspective, is because we tend, you know, this is true of any field, as we get more scientific and more empirically driven, we become more narrow in our focus, and there's a lot of depth, but there's very little perspective. So, you know, just to me, it's like, again, talking to business people and people in positions like venture capitalists and investors and private equity. I mean, the majority of people in our field don't even realize the importance of private equity or how investor profiles have changed. And to me, that's a lot of what's driving business today are things that are not, you know, we typically think of managers as the ones driving decisions, and that is no longer anyone. That is not reality, folks. Investors are driving a lot of decision making. So we've kind of have blinders in the sense that when we say investors, we think it's the field of finance and accounting, and we can just ignore them. And it's like, hello, this is a party that is now a major party in decision making, and we just totally ignore them and put them under the rubric of corporate governance, which is a small area of strategy. It's just an example of being just completely myopic and not recognizing the challenges that managers actually face in the reality of a business corporate landscape.
I see, Henry, you want to react?
Yeah, reflecting a little bit on a point that Margarethe made earlier and our general discussion, I think we talk about impact and we talk about methods, and I think we talk about dynamics. I like the point that Margarethe made earlier. We shouldn't build on results and theories that are outdated, and we shouldn't also obviously use methods that are outdated, or we should acknowledge the new possibilities that new methods or improvements in existing methods actually offer. And I think putting it together, I think one thing we should do is really think about what are some of these big questions that we haven't been able to answer, either because we didn't want to or because we couldn't. And then think about how the new methods or how improvements in methods allow us to specifically address those kinds of things. And I think that also helps us to navigate this challenge that if you have a method that's too novel, think about these synthetic samples, right? People will say, oh gosh, why would you do this? This is horrible. But there may be specific things where the trade-off between we don't know what's coming out of this versus we could never see anything otherwise is the most relevant, right? So really think about what are the strengths of certain new approaches and how do they help specifically with the biggest open issues from other approaches, because that's kind of the sweet spot, so to think. And I think we should all explore in our own research how we could identify those places.
Thank you. So I see, well, let me just double check. Michael and Tim, are you good?
I'll jump in with the question. I mean, well, two questions. So I agree with, I mean, it's hard to disagree with any of the comments that are being made. I'd almost ask everybody, but I do think, like, if you know the story of the blind men and the elephant, I think we're all talking about our various pieces of the elephant. You know, we don't want to, so it's not controversial that we don't want to be navel gazing. You know, I had somebody after last year's A1 plenary critique me for setting an agenda for the field. And if you know my situation, you know, I have no impact on my college, let alone the field. So, I mean, found that interesting from somebody I don't know. But I do think we could sit back and use forums like this to say what's strategy. I mean, I don't think it's a big ask to say, whoever you are, add a paragraph to your paper saying this is why I contribute to the field of strategic management and it's different from economics or psychology or sociology. I don't think that's a massive ask. I do think I agree, Henry, with everything you said about we have all these wonderful methods and not that I mean, I think I have one of the first papers using a two-stage technique in the SMJ. Agree. But I also wonder, as much as all these new methods have done for fields like labor economics, of whether they've helped or hindered strategic management. And so I think we have to be really careful about what's distinctive about the field. If it really is high levels of complementarity and interaction with rivals and whatnot, I don't know that these. I think that I don't want our research questions to be driven by the method or by the theory. To Margarethe's point. You know, I think we can have an interesting debate about to what extent the questions that have historically guided our field really should be driving our agenda in the future. I mean, those things should change. I guess there's a question of how much our explanations change or the questions change, and I don't have the answer. But I think those are the things where these kinds of debates or discussions are just fantastic to see everybody's perspective, at least in my opinion.
If I can quickly respond, I certainly did not mean to suggest the method should be driving the problem. I was more saying that in the end, we want to have the biggest problem with the most appropriate method. And given that we see dynamics in how developed the methods now are, or that new methods become available, we should then actually go back to the problems and say, well, we never did this because we didn't know how to. How can we actually do it, right? And I guess for the PhDs, for example, yes, it should not be I have a nice natural experiment, look what I have. But again, bring together the methods and the questions. And different people may have different approaches, right? It's like entrepreneurs, there's always problem and solution fit that you have to have. Some come with a problem, some with a solution. But we should revisit that both of these things change over time. What's important to people matters, it changes, and the method change. And I think especially when you have advisors who kind of more old school or something on either the methods or the problem side, right? There's a risk that you kind of stay in the old track, so to speak. And I think it's, you know, kind of, that's what the student should do, is kind of look beyond what the advisor says, and don't quote me on this one, to say, you know, where are some of those new complementarities between methods and problems to create value?
Violent agreement that good methods are good methods. Let's just not be using, you know, I think it's a much harder problem to, if you really think carefully about what a strategy problem looks like, I think it's a much harder standard to use whatever we want to use, you know, a natural experiment, a shock, a diff and diff, a two-stage model. I mean, whatever we want to use, it's a much harder challenge to really address a strategic question using some of those tools.
Thank you, Michael. So now I would like to open it to the participants, the floor. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask your questions out loud. I saw some in the chat. Or new questions. Imran, go ahead.
Thank you everyone for this wonderful session. It was great to participate. My question is directed to Dr. Henry. Dr. Henry, I am in complete agreement with what you mentioned. I work in the domain of NLP and machine learning techniques. Apart from this synthetic data generation through GPTs, we can also generate synthetic data through simulations, Monte Carlo or systems dynamic modeling. Specifically in the domain of strategic management, and taking from Dr. Michael, if we have interesting questions, I still feel that we have still not utilized creating synthetic data, especially when data is not available, but the correlations are available. Using those correlations, one can generate synthetic data using such techniques, for example, Monte Carlo or system dynamic modeling. So my question is that what should be the path ahead, especially related to the field of strategic management, how we can use synthetic data through simulation and not necessarily through GPTs? How can we use synthetic data to answer some of the important questions, like, for example, what Dr. Michael posed?
I'll pass it on to Michael, because I don't do simulations. I know there used to be a lot of attention to this. I've taken, a PhD course on, modeling organizational theory issues and so on. I don't think it has developed that much. That's my impression, and it would be good for us to think about why that is. What was it about the old style simulations that maybe didn't suffice for the new questions, or have we exhausted the space of what's possible with simulations? Actually, if you read that PNAS paper, I didn't mention it, but they actually do make a case for how new AI methods can also help the simulations in terms of identifying some of the parameters and so on. Right. So maybe there's also kind of, again, a new wave of simulations that we can do. But I'll pass it on to Michael to maybe reflect on what they've done in the field, or if he sees any way for simulations to address some of the questions he has identified as being unanswered.
I don't know if I like that, but thank you, Henry. Henry probably knows more about how to use certainly synthetic data than I do, Imran. So I'll respond partially to your question, just because I'm incapable of addressing fully your question. My request is, my suggestion, which is not addressing your question, is simply to be clear about how you're contributing to something called strategic management, so that something called strategic management exists 20 years from now. I'm fully aware of the challenge that a young scholar has of publishing in our journals, using careful methods to continue their career. I just worry that as we go down that path, that we might be foreclosing opportunities in the future. Okay, so that's my first point. Include a paragraph. I have run some simulations in some published research. It's very theory driven. So this will be my second point. So I have tried to compare and contrast and link is probably the best word. It's not integrate, let's say, different theories of sequential decision-making under uncertainty using simulation to show how these different approaches might be combined. I think that's possible. It's not the synthetic data that Henry's talking about that he knows more about than I do. I wonder, as we start thinking about being more behavioral still, is there a way? So, in the back of my mind, I've tried to get a PhD student to do this or I've suggested, I haven't tried to get a PhD student to do anything they don't want to do, but suggested lots of ways to run simulations around some of our existing theories and then run experiments. In some sense, you might think of combining the simulation with an experiment like Elena's suggesting. So let's say if you really believed in real option theory, or if you really believed in some version of transaction cost economics, or you really believed in some version of the factor market approach, you could design, I'm happy to share the math about a simulation that you could design, and then run an experiment like Elena and Chiara are suggesting to see whether and how individuals actually respond to this. They might be young individuals with underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, or they might be more senior executives like Margarethe's interacting with. We might give them all sorts of treatments, to see if people are primed in a particular way, they react differently. So I think there's ways to do this. I can't comment on the simulated data that Henry can, but I think there's ways to think about how we would advance the field in a meaningful way that engages with executives and engages with our theory and engages with what I would consider some of the distinctive questions in our field. I hope that helps.
Yes, that's insightful. Thank you, Dr. Henry.
Thank you, Imran, for the questions. Other questions from the audience?
I think we have time for one quick question. Okay.
There was also, okay, if I can maybe summarize some questions from the chat. So people were wondering, how do you connect with those executives or those entrepreneurs? And then also for Elena, how do you worry about the self-selection bias? Because people who agree on talking to you or on taking that experiment, you know, they have some kind of interest typically in the research. So if like Margarethe, team, or Elena, you want to comment on these?
I think I already kind of answered the question, but I'll reiterate it. When you're dealing with high-level individuals, you know, I've been fortunate to kind of already have connections through a lot of the activities I've done. I've done a lot of management consulting. I've done a lot of board education. I teach in board programs. But if you don't have access through those type of connections, usually if you're in a business school, the business school has a board of advisors, and those people are usually C-suite, and you can ask your dean to gain access to that. And then, like I said, once you've kind of connected to a few of those individuals, they usually will open up their own network to help you if they find that what you're interested in is worthwhile. You know, and the only thing I will add is, you know, before you talk to these people, don't just go in there with no idea of what you're going to talk about. You know, tell them the purpose of your research and what you're hoping to explore. And don't go in there with, this is my hypothesis. Okay, that's not the way to talk to execs, but you know, you're interested in understanding a particular issue or a particular topic, and that's how you would start and get their perspective on it. And usually they get very excited, and then they will try to connect you with other individuals that can help you understand that particular phenomena a bit better. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll
Tim,
second
go ahead.
the warm introduction. Warm introductions are wonderful. So even if you don't have a strong connection, warm introductions through different university contacts, through contacts from a prior life you might have, either in business or in school, whatever it may be, those warm introductions can play a major role. For entrepreneurs, I have had a lot of success reaching out via cold emails and LinkedIn connections and things like that. But certainly you get a higher response rate with the warm introductions. I will say a lot of the times, especially as PhD students, you can play the student card, and people are, I think, are almost more responsive, at least at the entrepreneur level, to students reaching out and saying, hey, can you help me out? I'm really interested to hear what you talk about. You can play the ego card too. Like I said, a lot of these people really, really do like to talk about what they're doing. And so saying like, we've identified you as a great example of what we are trying to study, that works as well. So there are various things you can try, but warm introductions, especially as you start talking about bigger organizations, higher up in the organization, make a lot of sense.
So I'll jump in, and so I think I can answer both questions at the same time, because how we tried to reduce as much as possible the selection bias was by basically trying to really cast a very wide net in attracting participants to this program. And I think we were relatively successful in this, in the sense that we achieved quite a broad variation inside our the type of entrepreneurs we attracted. The way we did that was basically to map the entrepreneurial journey and trying to understand what were the touch points of these entrepreneurs. So essentially, you know, we tried to advertise our program in places like, for example, company associations, the company house, and so on and so forth, where maybe more advanced entrepreneurs would connect. But we also tried to cast a wide net in other context. For example, social media pages that mention any words like entrepreneurs, startups, co-working spaces. So we advertise the program there, accelerators, but also cafeteria. Basically, by thinking entrepreneurs will typically go and work in cafeteria, so we'll just go and advertise there. So that's how we try to address this. However, it's obviously a very important question. So we are actually looking into it with the Innovation Growth Lab, and what we're trying to do is to compare the data of the recent interventions in the UK, beyond this one, with some more general data about the population of entrepreneurs, in order to understand, are these companies that join interventions different from the wider population of entrepreneurs in the UK. So hopefully we'll have some more answers in this area.
Thank you so much, Elena. I think that's also true of anyone working with survey. It's really important to report on the broader populations who might not have answered the survey. Okay, so I need to thank all our panelists here, and thank you so much. So Elena, Margarethe, Tim, Michael, and Henry. Thank you, Louise, for co-organizing. So this is recorded. Feel free to rewatch, share with your fellow researchers. I hope to hear about new research we're all conducting at AOM. And I leave it, maybe Louise, a final word of wisdom for everyone.
Yeah, no, I just want to say thank you to all of you. What a great conversation, very interesting. Thank you for sharing your experience, and thank you, Florence, for organizing and moderating the discussion today. Thank you so much, everyone.